Before we dive into this episode, we wanted to announce a contest to wrap up our first year of episodes. We want to showcase the up-and-coming ideas in the world of planning and design that will hopefully gain traction and make their way back onto our podcast as a book review episode. Are you going to be the person who comes up with a groundbreaking idea like new urbanism or form-based code? For more information on the contest, the deadlines, and the prizes in the two categories, student and practicing professional, head to bookedonplanning.com/contest.
Today's episode is brought to you by Marvin Planning Consultants. Marvin Planning Consultants works with communities of all sizes as well as county governments throughout Nebraska and the Midwest. Located in David City, we are a full-service planning firm working on comprehensive plans, zoning, housing, blighted and substandard studies, annexations, and other facets of community and county planning.
This is Booked on Planning, a bi-weekly podcast that breaks down the world we live in by paging through current and classic books. I'm Steph Rouse, and my co-host for this episode is Kurt Elder. Today we're joined by Jack Dangermond, the founder and president of ESRI. With a background in landscape architecture and urban design, he and his wife Laura founded ESRI in 1969 on the idea that computer-based mapping and analysis could make a significant contribution to geographic planning and environmental science. Since then, ESRI has become the global market leader in GIS with a strong user base of about 350,000 organizations around the world. Dangermond has received many acknowledgments and awards for his contributions to the field of geography, environmental science, planning, and GIS, including 13 honorary degrees.
I want to tie our professions together and ask about topics in the book and discuss how our respective roles are changing. I want to discuss tools and applications that can support the planning community, among others. So question one would be, what is your connection to the book, Thinking About GIS? And I want to tie the second question into that. How do you know the author?
Well, the book was written by Roger Tomlinson. He was both a very good personal friend, but also he was the person who really came up with the original name, Geographic Information Systems. So naturally, we became friends during the 70s. He did his early work actually even in the 60s up in Canada. And he became a consultant. He would work with organizations who needed to have a geographic information system. They would hire him and he would design systems. That's largely what his book is about, is how do you design an information system called a geographic information system. And we were tool builders largely. I mean, ESRI has a background of doing project work, especially during the 70s. But during the 80s, we took the tools that we were building, doing projects, and turned them into an actual product so that other people could actually replicate the applications that we were doing. Things like new town planning, finding a location for, almost anything, power plants, grocery stores, all sorts of things. So he had a client following. Really, it was in the beginning just a half a dozen organizations who wanted to actually automate their processes. They wanted to build what was called at the time a kind of geographic information system, which resembled other kinds of information systems, like information systems about money or people or those sorts of things. But they wanted to do it about geographic stuff. And this work started off largely in the inventory world, like forest inventories or natural resource inventories. And then as the technology and as the profession emerged, it started to move into urban geographic information systems. Through his professional practice, he began to give lectures. And I urged him that he should write what he was lecturing about as a book. And it took him many years to write this book, but I promised him that we would publish it if he wrote it up. So he went through his sort of systematic process of looking at user needs, looking at available data, organizing it into a systematic way of thinking, and building an information system with hardware and software and training and all of that sort of stuff. Well, the book emerged and it became popular. It became a popular item within the GIS profession because it was an independent book that documented what we would call a systems approach for developing an information system. And it's a great text. That's what I would say about it.
I would agree. One of my latter questions hits on the fact that the book is about GIS planning and it's about a critical thinking, systems thinking mindset. That's something that both the GIS profession and the planning profession do on a daily basis, and just finding that common nexus of saying this technology isn't that far off from what we do. We just need to do it differently.
Right. Well, planning for land use and planning for cities and planning for forests and so on is similar to planning for creating an information system. And in this sense, the sort of concepts are similar, but they're really very different sorts of things. In one case, we're dealing with, technology. Not that we don't deal with technology in planning, but it's, so the concept and definition of a word called planning applies to both of them.
Correct, right. How would you define GIS just to the screen planner, whether it be short or long?
Well, it's an information system, and today we don't really have to define much about what is an information system. We have it all around us. We're living in a technical world where we have automated workflows and digitized data sets about everything that moves and changes, everything that we transact with today is either now or becoming digital. And this has transformed our way of being as human beings on the planet. A geographic information system is focused very much on geographic stuff. And here's where the parallel is to planning. Planners work with geographic stuff, land uses, buildings, parcels, transportation networks, environmental stuff, people, everything like in the physical environment, everything in the economic environment, and everything in the social environment. And it just turns out that geography, which is the science of our world, is a framework for organizing those big three dimensions. In a way, it kind of is a framework for bringing them all together in an information system. So we have information systems certainly about landscape or urban patterns, and we have information systems about money and economy, and we see that a lot today in the news. And we also have systematic thinking about people, everything from demographics and social status and social equity to, what's happening with food and income distribution. All of these are factors that are really important for a planner to think about. And I'll just emphasize that geography, which is this amazing science, is the only science that actually integrates all of these factors together. And the digital version of that science is called GIS. And in that sense, it's an amazing technology because from my perspective, it is the only technology whose central focus is about integrating things. So recently I've been emphasizing not so much about GIS, but about something I like to call the geographic approach. And the geographic approach is a way of thinking, very natural to planners. It's a set of methods and tools that are all about problem solving, integration, problem solving, and so on. And the unique characteristic about this geographic approach is that it's an approach that brings about holism. So much of the problems that we face today are resulting from sectorial views of the world. And while sectors and divisions and divisional organization of everything is very important for us to live in a modern society, it has also resulted in this division that sometimes doesn't facilitate integration. Okay, let me use the words holistic or integrated or collaborative or inclusive or connected, right? These 5 words are really important, and they're all embodied when we look at layering maps, for example, in the geographic approach. So to make it more real for your listeners, I'll simply say that geography's language, well, geography is a language and it's a science, but it also maps are a kind of way to express that language. And these maps can describe everything. They describe those 3 critical dimensions of the environment and the economy and society. And so you bring these map layers together and you see things. Planners have the opportunity particularly to visualize and then do geodesign on those layers in very powerful ways. Now, GIS is a lot of things to a lot of people, Kurt. Sometimes it's just an accounting system.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And it does wonderful things. accounting for the forest or accounting for the water or accounting for climate. And other people use it just as a mapping system. They make maps like topographic maps or soil maps or vegetation maps. So they are systems of record documenting reality. And then there is this other world of geographic analysis where we can take those layers and overlay them not just as plastic overlays, but computationally. And geoanalytics, the sort of third component of this, is about looking at relationships and patterns and processes. This is the magic of what understanding is all about. So geo-understanding, which is the foundation for action, human action, or geo-understanding, which should be the foundation for planners to make decisions or do evaluations, is grounded in this idea of geography.
Right.
And so in addition to, let me just systematically go through this. Number one, documenting the systems of record. Number two, a framework for visualizing and mapping or doing accounting, geo-accounting. Number three, it's a framework for analytics, geoanalytics. And then number four, or number five, however you want to do the counting, is this idea of evaluation. So geo-evaluation, you can basically evaluate alternative proposals and see the impacts of them. This is very powerful. If I put a freeway here, how is it going to affect this social neighborhood? Well, how do you know that unless you bring it all together? Or if I allow this development to occur here, what's it going to do to the biodiversity of the region or the lifestyle of these people or the physical sewer infrastructure? All these factors that planners have to deal with can be brought together using geography as a kind of foundation for organizing their data and their analytics and their communications and so on.
I have enjoyed this conversation so much for a variety of reasons. One is that you are just so good at teeing up the next questions. The one that I had next was, how would you define or describe thinking spatially to a green planner? But you've done that pretty well, I believe, just in talking about those 5 areas, ranging from overlay down to geo understanding to geo evaluation. That's thinking spatially. And I think that's a great answer. So I'm going to go on to the next one. Planners would say, make no small plans, and whereas GIS professionals would say, we see what others cannot. I still like that tagline. I believe that together a better future is possible. How has the collaboration between the planning profession and the GIS data science profession changed over time? Back in 1960, 1970, was it a slow uptake by the planning profession? Because now it seems like we work really well together. What's your take on that?
Well, one last thought, Kurt, is in addition to geovisualization and geoanalytics and geo-accounting and so on, there's a missing element, which is the bridge into your question, which is geodesign.
Mm-hmm.
Geodesign is actually the blending of geography and the design or planner community. I mean, we use all of the geographic input, like suitability mapping and mapping in general, to generate a plan. And a plan is not just pick the site for one thing. It's mixing different uses together, blending them. And that is best done by a designer. And humans are designers. We design our life. We design our way to work. We design who we marry. People design their lives. And when you do that, you go through a series of evaluations of different alternatives. Should I take this way to work, or should I marry this person, or shall I do this, or shall I do that? And the combination of these choices represent a plan. And we don't always know on the front end which plan or combination of alternative decisions is the best one. So GIS really helps us both direct the planning, designing process, but also gives us a framework for evaluating alternative plans quickly. There is no optimum plan, either for life, as we all know,
No.
or for a city. There's really a collection of different alternatives, and planners particularly are skilled at looking at and evaluating these alternatives, coming up with a suboptimum, or I'd just say a combination of different patterns to create the plan. And that has to involve communities, involvement. It requires listening. It requires thinking. It requires bringing the scientific data together. And then it requires supporting those people who do the design process and evaluating them and ultimately decisions. So a simple way to say it is GIS creates understanding, which precedes action, meaning design and evaluation. It both guides planners, but it also provides a framework of information for evaluating alternative designs. This got me excited when I was at university. I mean, I first saw it and I thought, oh my God. At that time, this was during the 60s, the Vietnam War was going on. There was social disparity, polarization, somewhat like we're having today. Silent Spring was written by Rachel Carson. There was kind of this emerging environmental awareness. And at the time, I was sort of young and very impressionable. I really loved all of that idea. And then all of a sudden, I realized the combination of geography and computing could be a framework or a platform for us to really move forward with more progressive and rational thinking or rational-based or systems-based planning and environmental planning. And as a young landscape architect, boy, that just sort of like sang music because I saw, I got so passionate about it, I could hardly sleep at night. At the time, I had a lovely job. I was going to school in landscape architecture at Harvard and had a really neat job at the Harvard Lab for Computer Map Making and Analytics. That was one of the birthplaces. Roger did his thing up in Canada, but the lab did its thing in terms of computer map making early days. And that origin, rather than focusing in on inventories and systems of record keeping like Roger's work did, it focused on design. And one of the great authors there was Carl Steinitz. He's still alive, and he's working on the geodesign element continuously, even now in his 80s. These two passions, in a way, blended in my life through the work in the 70s and the 80s and creating products and so on.
Planning is the management of change over time. And in my view, which I wrote this before listening to this great conversation so far, was that, GIS is a system that creates and manages, analyzes, maps, and provides value to all types of data. And as I said earlier, this book is really about strategic thinking. And through this conversation, I would say that together we being our profession, GIS profession, the planning profession, plan, and we adjust to social and political pressures, and we work to gain buy-in from all kinds of partners, and then we work to implement them. In today's environment, if a planner were in a small community office or business of a varying size, do you think that the broad process for entry that was described in this book, which is a systematic approach of getting buy-in of all kinds, that's the system that's the process he laid out, is still the preferred method for those kinds of communities and entities to enter into the GIS world, or has the lower cost of storage, faster multi-threaded CPUs, support systems, your wonderful online training, or the general affordability of software and cloud solutions? Has the lowering of cost turned that immense effort that was described in this book into something easier? Short version being, is it easier to get into GIS now than it was 10 years ago? And if so, will that trend continue?
Well, you said a lot there.
I did. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Roger's book was designed for people who wanted to design a massive system at a time when technology was very expensive. So its value as a textbook for teaching GIS professionals is immensely, well, it's just a great contribution. But today, the world has changed. You can have GIS on your iPhone, accessing a cloud system, and you can make maps, you can do analytics, you can do all sorts of things with a whole different technology. But still, behind those components of a GIS requires a kind of system architecture and the same kind of thinking that Roger promoted. The history of GIS it started on mainframe computers. I mean, when I first started making computer maps, it would take me 8 hours and an overnight run on a mainframe computer to get a map out. And it was really crazy.
Just for context sake, how big was the mainframe machine for those of us that don't know what a mainframe was?
Well, it was about half of a square block at Harvard University's computer center. It was just huge.
And had its own nuclear power plant power plant to supply it, right?
I didn't pay much attention to that,
Okay.
but I know that I brought my deck of cards down there and submitted it, and it would be 8 hours before I'd get a run back. And I mean, it took me dozens and dozens of tries to get my first map. It was really difficult. But once I did, I just, it's like magic. And while it was definitely not practical at the time for planners to use, the concepts of the geographic approach and geodesign were clearly being laid out. So a lot of my life has been to take awkward technology, try to simplify it, and make it available to users. So for 10 years, we did project work, like I said, all over the world. We did these projects, and people would use us because we were environmental planners and landscape planners, not because we use computers. And a lot of times we didn't tell them. We'd show them the results, and, oh, that's really interesting. But they weren't buying the method. They were buying the results. And that's also true today, as people can get enamored with, over enamored with the basic technology. In many ways, like Steve Jobs did with the iPhone, we want to make the technology invisible. Just give us the results. And there's still a gap there. And we're working on filling that gap. And GIS professionals who know the science of geography, they also know the technology where it can be deployed effectively. And they know how to support people. That's the sort of magical formula that's necessary today. And their lives are getting better. I mean, there's probably, depending upon how you define it, a couple million of these people around the planet. And they range from very simple applications to ones that are building very complex systems that, for example, run USGS mapping or run, major utilities or run cities like Abu Dhabi or Los Angeles or different places. And it's often not just one person doing it. It's a collection of people that live in different departments that are managing the data and then bringing it together. Planners oftentimes are the ones who are the recipients of all this data that's being managed by all the other departments or other organizations. They are the ones who are chartered with bringing it together. Take climate change, for example. We're currently working with the White House and President Biden's initiative of being able to take all the science data from the federal government and boil it down in such a way and simplify it so that local planners, cities, counties, and states can actually bring that together as web maps, overlay it in their own city, put their own facilities on top of it, and do planning, evaluate how to make their city resilient, given what's happening in the next 10, 20, 50 years. I mean, everybody's heard these stories about Katrina, the hurricane coming in and knocking everything down, and then people went back in and rebuilt them. It's not good. And this is happening with the huge advances that are happening in the huge evolution of the planet with respect to climate change. Planners need to consider issues of drought, issues of flooding, issues of extreme heat, issues of loss of biodiversity. All these factors have to be brought together. And many planners can't actually afford to bring their own data together. I mean, they're having trouble just keeping their zoning data up to date. And that's a real job. And you can do it inside of a GIS and you can pump out the plans. But how do you bring all these other factors into it? Well, the miracle that's occurring now with GIS technology is something called web services. So web services and web maps allow one organization to maintain a system of record. Let's just say flooding or fire or drought or vegetation cover. One organization's maintaining that layer and they publish it on the web as a web map. And I can grab that web map, not a copy of it, but the map service, and bring it into my GIS and overlay it with my data. So voila, I'm using somebody else's data as part of my GIS infrastructure. And this integration from many sources of distributed data sets on the weather, on soil, on land use change, on transportation, means that for planners, they can actually simplify their GIS quite a bit. The cities can use the county's parcel maps. Here in Southern California, we have SCAG, this Association of Governments, who has brought together 192 of the cities into a regional system where they're, with web services, sharing information and using each other's data to create comprehensive plans. Wow, this is unbelievable when we think about that. We would have to, in the past, bring all this data together into a regional information system that then we could do our planning. No, now we can dial tone this stuff in, and planners can use each other's data, like on adjacent communities. How do we connect this road to this road? This is a miracle of the current web GIS technology.
I would only add to that, what helps make that possible is just better communication to come up with, similar schemas, just to better define your own vocabulary and how you approach that workflow.
Yeah, it's true. And also the miracles of very fast computing allow us to transform dynamically schema to schema. I'm not saying there isn't rough edges and that there isn't a major role for people that are in the data science area for harmonizing this information. But as I sort of see it and abstract it, this is literally a foundation for transforming how planners do planning. I like to call that geospatial infrastructure. So thousands, there are now, this is hard to believe, Kurt, but there are now over, let me get my numbers right, over 50 million data sets and services that have been shared on the web. They're organized in something we call ArcGIS Online. It's open, but users are sharing their information in this cloud referencing system. So if I want to find soils on southern Nebraska, I can search and I can find it and I can bring it in as a dial tone and then overlay it against my data. That's like a miracle. And it's only beginning, this idea of geospatial infrastructure. And again, this is an abstraction. But I think of the geospatial infrastructure like the web itself, except that on the web is basically all the measurements of virtually all the change that's ongoing in real time. That really is like a nervous system for the planet. And you know what a nervous system is like? It's all about stimulus, cogitation, and action. That's how your mind works. You feel heat, you see something, your mind thinks about it, and then you act. And so if we look at the planet, where GIS is going is through the collection of hundreds of thousands of organizations, all collecting data about their little patch, or sometimes the whole world. They're bringing that information together, sharing it. And now, like Google, the miracle of Google search, we can find the geographic data that we need. Maybe not all of it, but a lot of it, and have this new kind of GIS. And that requires a lot of things. It requires people, mostly. That's the big limitation today, is people who actually get it, that think geographically. And for planners, your audience particularly, that means, planners are spatially literate. They think geographically, or they better.
I hope they do too.
I hope they do. They have to think geographically. That's really, and they approach problem solving, the creation of their plans or managing their plans using this geographic approach. And then they create new plans that get, again, published and usable by other organizations. Like land use planners, data is used by utilities, and it's used by commercial organizations, used by transportation planners. It's an ecosystem, and that ecosystem of participants, all these different players, science people, planning people, actors of all types, are becoming connected. How? Oh, through the internet of services. And what else? Geography. Location is the common thing that allows us to bring disparate information together.
Within the book, Dr. Tomlinson, said that turning data into a data product via spatial analysis was the real value of a GIS system. If we take that, just as we talked about just in this conversation, and then take this idea of big data and how it's changed over time, moving from smaller dispersed data sets to now having big lakes of data out there that we can now access and push commands to, and due to all this computational power, just really leverage. And then taking it further, and just to what you were saying here about, going forward, creating plans, being geographic of mind. When we think of the future and in being a strategic thinker for the future, whether it be a planner, a technician, an analyst, a developer, engaged citizen, what are the skills, tools, or experiences that will be needed to solve our future problems? That's a big question. What are we lacking now that we need more of in the future?
Well, let me peel apart some of your questions.
Please do.
First, in the area of analytics. In the case of geographic analytics, it's all about prediction. I mean, there's creation and there's prediction. Planners facilitate the creation of the future, and models, analytics, spatial analytics, geographic analytics, predict what's going to happen. Some people are predicting traffic as opposed to this, as a result of, say, this land use plan, this is going to be the traffic that's on the highway network. Some of our users are predicting what's happening as a result of climate change to agricultural production in the Midwest. All the corn's going to have to move north over the next 30 years, 300 or 400 miles just to deal with the climate change. So
that was a great planetary presentation at the 2022 USC.
Yeah,
by the way. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, it really opens your eyes to the fact that analytics are important. But if you were at the UC this year, you would have noticed that I pointed out this book. This is Jane Goodall's book on, she called it Local Voices, Local Choices. And it's all about planning. I really invite you to study this book because it's all about planning in Tanzania with local villages, where she uses GIS as a way to get people to create a community plan. And her big approach is listening and then interpreting and facilitating local voices to create a plan which is based on real needs of local, in this case, villagers, conservation planning, agricultural planning, economic planning, and so on. So to answer your question, what's needed and wanted are people that listen and take this geographic information that's increasingly available and help communities understand and facilitate a process where they both understand and can interpret this data in such a way that, a more sustainable future in land use terms is created for cities. And I just find that talent is often missing, both in GIS people and also in planners. They're not into listening and facilitating. They're not into creating communities. They're not interested so much in creating the consensus part. And whether you're building an information system with hardware and software, you need to have that exact same process, or whether you are building a community plan, you also need to have a process of listening, facilitating, creating consensus, and using all our best science and technologies to be able to make that happen.
So within the book, GIS education of varying degrees. Within the book, it was educating managers and elected officials about the value and use of what is being produced and why it should be supported over a period of time. That version of GIS education to the broader, spatial thinking education was also discussed and was brought up again numerous times. At what point do you think that we should begin to really start teaching children the importance of thinking spatially? To our planners, would you please contemplate this answer with when you think kids should start learning more about community planning? I think it'd just be interesting, which comes first, chicken or the egg? Or are they both going down the track together?
I have two answers. The first answer is Roger and myself believe very strongly in something called educating up.
Right.
And that really means getting executives trained or introduced at least to the basic concepts of what's possible with GIS. We started in 1987, something called a senior executive track at our users conference, where we bring in first a few dozen. Now I think it's about 300 senior executives. These are mayors, governors, people that oversee organizations in the government, sometimes, vice presidents and so on of companies. We'd bring them into a room. We let actually executives that manage GIS people talk to other executives and tell them their real experience. And these stories are fascinating, actually. They talk about the business value in executive terms, not, technology terms. They also talk about the human dimension of how you make these organizations come together. And somehow through sharing and conversation, people get this much faster than reading a book. So Roger's book is really good, but who's going to read it? Some executives do, most don't. I mean, you look this year, we had the governor of Minnesota there, and he was just he shared his real experience of leading a state in the application of GIS effectively. And we've had Governor O'Malley from Maryland. He did the same thing. And our own governor here in California, Newsom, is completely excited about the application of GIS for running his state government. But unless you hear from somebody who actually has applied it in this way, it's hard for executives to really get off it and see the business value and see the results. So that's one thing that we pioneered with Roger. The other end of the scale is K through 12. So this started with a person called Charlie Fitzpatrick, and I think it was 1991. We had invented a new technology called ArcView, and it was a little desktop tool that allowed anybody to simply make a map and do simple analysis. I mean, there was a teacher in Detroit who asked us if he could get some copies of it, and he'd like to use it in his classroom, high school, Central City, Detroit, Cass High School. And I said, okay, take these and try it. And he invented a methodology which now has been applied in over 20,000 school districts around the world. And it's a learn by doing method. He asked his class, a bunch of kids in their, 15, 16-year-old kids, rough neighborhoods, to say, would you like to do a project? Yeah, we'd like to do a project. Okay. So step one was to identify a project. He asked them what project they'd like to do, and they said, lead poisoning. Teacher was shocked. What are these kids doing? He said, well, I don't know if you know what lead poisoning is really about, but it has to do with before 1960, lead paint was used in homes and in dilapidated structures, peels off and little babies crawl around on the floor and they chew lead because it's sweet and it, ruins their brain. So he said, okay, then why don't you, step number 2, measure it. So the kids went down to the Department of Health. They got all the statistics about lead paint, brought it back, put it onto a map, dots on a map. And he said, okay, why don't you analyze why these patterns exist? So they got other census layers and layered them against these dots, and they found this amazing conclusion that if the lead paint was in neighborhoods with that were poor and had a lot of dilapidated homes in them. And the kids just realized that this connection between lead poisoning and these dilapidated homes. And the teacher said, okay, why don't you, step number 4, why don't you design a solution for this? And the kids came up with this brilliant idea of hiring all the high school students for the summer, scraping all the lead paint off these dilapidated homes and painting them over with latex. And okay, so the kids dancing around, you can see their excitement. He said, okay, how are you going to action that? Step 5. So the kids took these maps down to the city council, hung them up on the wall in Detroit. This was before the big collapses that occurred in Detroit. Hung them with, okay, city council, everybody's in tears. Said, okay, let's get these kids $300,000 to hire all the high school students for the summer and get the job done, which they did. So it's a 5-step method. And this teacher taught identifying a civic issue to kids. It's kind of a learn by doing. What's wrong in your neighborhood? Then taught them measurement. Then taught them problem solving, creating a solution, analytics, problem solving, and then actioning it. 5 steps. And so we took that, wrote a book about it, and promoted it. President Obama worked with us to get this a free set of these softwares, which continues today to virtually every K through 12 school in America. And then we expanded it to every school in the world. And there are literally thousands of teachers and kids who are going through this kind of a 5-step method with books and curriculum. And it's not for everyone. It's focused more on the STEM education bent of schools. But it's teaching kids civic involvement. It teaches them problem solving and planning, getting engaged, and has resulted in miracles across America. So I mean, you picked on the right person here to ask this question. I believe that engagement with kids using the technology as a way, because it's very seductive. I mean, it's like video games, getting them involved in collecting data in their community. And so I have videos that I've prepared that I'd be happy to share with you downtown Los Angeles at Roosevelt High School. I mean, it has been transformational to get kids into college as a result of it. One last thing I want to say about it, and I'm sorry to motormouth on this, is that in the late 80s, early 90s, Gil Grosvenor, who used to run National Geographic, and I funded a National Academy study to look at how spatial literacy was related to literacy. And what we discovered in this study is that kids who were able to learn spatial literacy tended to do better in other classes. That's really a remarkable piece of science that is, say it a different way, if kids know how to work with maps and geographic data, they tend to do better in math and science and English and every other damn thing. And the numbers were pretty significant in this regard. So I'm a fanatic about teaching kids right brain skills. You know, it is transformational in how they grow up and how they achieve different aspects of their career.
I believe that enabling curiosity and then enabling action is just so impactful to kids, because if you trust them to be curious and do something about it, they will. And I think that this conversation is just proof of that.
Yeah, I'll send you a link on this, Kurt, if you'd like,
Please do.
that your listeners can link to, because it will, when you see this very short video, you'll see transformation action in downtown central LA.
Wonderful. At the UC conference in 2019, you had shared that we as GIS professionals should rebrand, and that's how I took it, towards the role of information intelligence. You had made mention that, we have business intelligence and business analysis, but let's rebrand ourselves as information intelligence. I really took that to heart, and so if you would look at any of my email signatures, that is what I used. But as I was reading this book, I was wondering if perhaps was that your addition to this great work? Was this an effort to add into the line that Dr. Tomlinson started by saying we are more than just creating the system, we are doing the analysis with it? Or if there was a whole other reason just for that change of paradigm, what was the reasoning behind information intelligence?
I think these ideas continue to evolve. I think they have no single author. They just are all evolving in parallel. How we understand things, how we communicate things, how we brand things is an evolutionary process. I can't say that what I'm doing today really had its origins, 55 years ago as a student. No, I can't say that. But I mean, this confluence of so many different players, and Roger was certainly one of them. Duane Marble was a real strong advocate of spatial analytics, and all of their students and colleagues like Michael Goodchild and Dave Simonet. And I mean, these are early runners. Quantitative geography has been evolving almost as an independent thought process from the time of Waldo Tobler and others, John Borchard. And they had the early thought of, can we put data into a computer and do analytics of various types? And some of them were sort of almost administrative, like Roger performed in his inventory analysis. There's more of this here than there is there. And that served a particular purpose. Today's tools of big data analytics and real-time, in-stream analytics of things spatially are a whole world that we could hardly even think about at the time. And that is impacting how people think. These things tend to co-evolve. Our thinking is co-evolving with technology. And there was once a very famous Nobel laureate that talked about, with every advance in technique, there's an advance in method. So our work in planning and in science in general is co-evolving with, civilization's understanding of what this means, and also how we participate and play in it. So I'm being a bit abstract here. I suppose you could say that any one of the individuals that were early players conceived of all that would happen with spatial analytics. I don't know that that's true.
When I listened to it, it touched me because I had, as both a planner and a GIS professional, I can explain what I do as planning, but
yes,
within different offices and just not the ones I have in my mind. Sometimes they will look at GIS professionals as simply just the map guy, the data guy.
Sure. Yes,
but you don't call a carpenter a hammer because of the tool that he uses.
You are self-internalizing information and playing a role, just like I did.
Right.
And, these names, like I would call it a spatial data scientist or a spatial intelligence analyst or a geointelligence analyst, as they sometimes refer to them in the intel community. These are names, and you, in many ways, you embrace them and you take it as a role and you grow it. It's all about other people recognizing this amazing emerging phenomena, and they recognize it through individuals' contributions and sometimes titles and in complex organizations as we move forward. And, you just have to do titling. I learned this early on. And without titles and without job descriptions, you're sort of lost because it's just amorphous. So I think everybody does this. I think I like what you've done, and you own it, and you're making a profession out of it.
Well, thank you. So kind of moving into one of our final sections, which is discussing how tools that are available to both planning profession and then us as the GIS profession can better enable planning. How are planners or other problem solvers utilizing those tools that you have to plan? Some of the tools that I've enjoyed in the past is Arc Urban. Just learning more about velocity at this year's conference looks just so amazing. But even if it's just something that's perhaps a couple of years older, such as story maps, just to help convey what it is that we're proposing and just stepping through it and moving forward. What are some of those tools that you think that planners should be using or need to learn to use better to help bridge that gap between those who have time to really get in the weeds and those who don't?
Well, it's an interesting history about GIS and my own life. Coming from the planning and landscape architecture background, I always had this vision that we would build great tools that would help do the very work that I was trained to do. And in the beginning,
put yourself out of a job.
Yeah, put myself out of a job, I suppose. Or just get the opportunity to really do what I was originally trained to do using computer tools. And that sort of evolved along. In the beginning, we had 40 functions that were done in an early piece of software, and they always worked. That's what made them marvelous. You could always make a pretty simple map. You could digitize data. You could do polygon overlay, very simple tools. And over the last 40 years or so, those tools kept getting easier and better and stronger and bigger for doing other kinds of application work. But there has not been the focus on, and I would say planners and GIS professionals have used those tools in various ways to do planning work. But in the last few years, we've been trying to say, okay, can we build tools that actually operate for a planner in a way that doesn't require the planner to become a GIS professional himself or herself? So one of those tools has been ArcGIS Urban, and that has been for urban designers and urban planners who wanted to go through a process of bringing all the data together, sketching out alternatives, evaluating the alternatives, and then going forward with participation from, citizens going forward with a plan that really works. And that has now been implemented, I think, in nearly 500 organizations, big cities like Singapore and San Francisco, down to little communities like, different ones around the world. So I would say planners, if you want to study something, look at ArcGIS Urban. Then the other dimension that you mentioned is real time. We are wiring up virtually everything that moves and changes in cities with IoT measurements. And now it's possible to stream all of those measurements, whether they're movements of buses or flows of water in stationary facilities or events that are happening in crime in real time. It's possible to bring all that information together right into a GIS so that GISs are becoming real time. And that's not so much of interest to the long range planner, but the person who's running, transactional real time operations. Wow, that's changing things. And whether it's in a, electrical utility or a water agency or even, in public safety, it's going to revolutionize things. The other one is field. All these new apps that are on iPhones or Android devices, I can basically capture the data. And when I capture it in real time, somebody else on a dashboard can see what's happened. And this is best understood by people when they looked at the, coronavirus Johns Hopkins dashboard. They pulled together data off of the web and it's, seen visually. But now we can actually take field units, people in every city that are doing the field work, inspections, statistical collection, and do exactly the same thing. I can see where they are, where those people are, how they're progressing, what they're doing, and also identify real-time problems that need urgent support, kind of like the 311 operations, except from field people in the city. Those are big transformational things, Kurt, that I think are going to turn the city on its side. I mean, there always has been this idea of real-time planning. And now with being able to measure everything, bring it in, the role of planners will become more dynamic and more interesting from my perspective.
One of the tools that I saw at the last user conference was, I think it was Arc Knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the example that was used at the conference was the disaster relief after a hurricane in Louisiana. I took my mind someplace else and I took it to something locally we do here. Locally, if you get a social service support from any one of our front doors, you scan a card. So we know at what point you have had a certain life experience, whether it's entering or exiting homelessness, something else. And we then know what other social supports you've gotten over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I really just want to better understand what are some of those main breakpoints. And I think that tool will be really useful for that.
It's not for everyone.
No, it's not. No.
Knowledge. It's for the people like yourself in a way who are interested in building entity relationship network diagrams, draw the kind of relationship among things independent of where they live in geography, but also related to where they live in geography. Like an event happens here, an event happens here, we know they're connected, or an individual is here, an individual is there, we know they're connected, they have a relationship. We see this in things like gangs, or Al-Qaeda, where, we see a king player and this person gets arrested or something and all of a sudden the whole network falls apart. Or we see it with supply chains, like movement of, it's manufactured here, it goes to here, then it goes into something else. These kind of trees and networks of supply chains need to be analyzed. And while network analysis like this, or so-called graph analysis, has been around for some time, it's never been put into a GIS so that we can look at not only these networks, but also see them visually in time and space. So it's early days, I would say, for this work, but it's so intuitive that I believe the integration of these graphs and entity relationship diagrams is going to have real payoff in urban management.
You've been with your company for 42 years. What kind of skill set do we need to be ready for the future? You said listening. And so I'm curious about, as you look at your leadership style from the earlier days to now, and knowing that listening is so important, what kind of leadership style do you have and how has that changed over time? Were you very much of a transformational or transactional? Are you just very authentic now? How would you describe your style?
It's hard to know my style. I know my experience when I was a young kid, when we first started, it was a startup, right? And
right.
My wife and I and one assistant and a programmer and a data person basically did everything. We swept the floors, we put up the sides, we did our graphics, we did everything. And so when you build a company, it's now, I think, 12,000 people around the world like ours, and you start by having to do everything yourself, you have a certain insight into how everything works. and also, over the years, we were limited with sort of blinders on with respect to certain kinds of activities, and we made mistakes. So as we grew, we kept bringing in people that we would assess were smarter than us in different areas, smarter in software development, smarter in production management, smarter in accounting, smarter in HR. And as we organically grew, we never brought in money. We never borrowed. We never kind of leveraged somebody else's money. We just grew organically. As we bring in good people, all of a sudden, whole new levels of understanding would occur. So I think from a management perspective, I really support my people. I always have. And I like to be involved in things, but not if they can do it better than me. And you learn which ones really can do it effectively. So I don't want to think of ESRI as a model for great organizations. It's a good model. I mean, we have a lot of flatness in our organization. We have a lot of participation by a lot of people. It's actually a great place to work. We try to look at our users first, then we look at our employees and try to grow them. And we bring in new people that know better than us. We also have a lot of investment in learning, put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people through college to finish their degrees or get advanced degrees. And keeping that inside is, it just progressively gets better. And like I say, I'm not exactly a genius about a lot of things. People sometimes make that up, but I have learned that getting better people than me to do different operations really seems to be successful.
I think that kindness goes a long way in all facets of life, from whether it be friendships to employer and employee relationships.
Yes.
The currency that we as planners and GIS professionals deal in is trust.
Mm-hmm.
I truly believe that. Certifications help validate that trust, but it feels like that sometimes certifications aren't enough anymore. With so much IoTs and like big data and being able to see things, some people get very, very concerned about that. How do we win back those who may fear our ability to know and see too much?
I don't have a simple answer. I think trust is really very important, both in running this organization. You lose people's trust, better find a different job. It's not good.
Right.
With respect to trust of digital information or scientific information, this is all being challenged today with the polarization in our society. I tend to not want to go to the right or to the left on anything. I want to just go forward. It's always been my philosophy. Just go forward with science, rational thinking, systematic methods. And that's the role of certainly GIS professionals. And I would assert that that's also the role of planners, is to facilitate, not be the one. And those who, in my life experience, have been most successful tend to play that role. And, it's not so ego satisfying, but it's a way to be effective. And considering the challenges that we're all facing, we need more people like that. Like I said, it's not the technology. The technology is taking care of itself. Nobody's voting for the technology. It's just going in the direction of getting better. What is important is to have strong value-based people that can take this technology and do the right thing with it. And part of doing the right thing is maintaining the public's trust.
Who are your mentors today, right now? Whether they be with us today or they've passed, who is someone that you still look to as, I just look up to them still?
Well, I've had so many, actually. I'm always hunting for them. I'm always hunting for in every relationship, what can I learn and what can I grow from? How can I participate? I always look to people that are very, very smart. Bucky Fuller is what inspired me as a graduate student at Minnesota. I went there because of him in the experimental city. And he had a very clever and interesting mind. And then at Harvard, individuals like Carl Steinitz were very influential. And John Borchard, when I was at Minnesota, a great geographer. And Ian McCard, in his writings, was amazing. I mean, he pushed forward in his work. But then John Galbraith in economics was a professor that I really liked. E.O. Wilson, in more recent years, he just passed away, was both a close friend, but also somebody who's taught me a lot. And Roger, of course, was a wonderful mentor. Dwayne Marble, John Borchard, these people are always in the back of my mind. But then today at ESRI or in our user communities, there's people that are pushing it. And I have the same admiration for them, both in government and in our user community, names that are in political important positions. I always honor them and seek to figure out how I can support them in some of their big visions.
When I look at mentors, I look at someone that I value their character and then how they treat others beneath them.
Mm-hmm.
And those, just as you would say, those who are smarter than me, because I really like having smart friends, especially accountants.
Yeah, well, look, I'll say this. I always hunt for mentorable behaviors in people because no one's perfect, actually. But I just think there are so many people that are influencing my life right now. Richard Saul Wurman, the founder of TED, I talk to him very frequently. He's now 87. And, he won't be along that much longer, neither will I. But I always get something valuable out of talking with him. And he's sometimes, I'll take everything he says with a grain of salt. And I just genuinely like having a relationship with someone like that. And there are, in my life right now, Dr. Kent Smith, there are just dozens of these people that I like to be around because it's not about playing cards together or, going on no, we're constantly pushing it and learning together. That kind of idea of going big together. This is kind of a thing that inspires me, is hunting for relationships that really enrich my life and my mission of what I want to accomplish, making a difference on the planet.
Again, thank you, Jack, for joining us for this episode. I think it's been a really great conversation. I haven't really needed to jump in and interject any color commentary because it's been just very interesting listening as a planner that's using GIS, but isn't necessarily the one that understands the back end. And I have great people like Kurt and others in our offices that can help me with that. But I want to close out our conversation by asking if there's anything we didn't cover, or if there's any big points that you want to make for our listeners or big takeaways for this conversation.
Well, look, planners, all of you listening, and your work and how you do your work are very important. You possess the skills and the methods that are so important today. And only you, it seems to me, have the insight and the ability to create solutions to address the great challenges that we're facing today as a global society. And for whatever reason you want to make up, you are privileged and I would say are being called upon at this particular moment in history to address the great issues of our time, dealing with understanding and creating collaboration to come up with better solutions. And history is going to judge all of us in terms of our effectiveness to be able to create these solutions to turn it around. And turning it around, what I mean by that is dramatic transformation of the way that our world is operating today. So I really want to wish you great luck, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with planners. You have my hearts and minds.
Well, thank you so much, Jack. I won't speak for everyone, but I've enjoyed this immensely, and thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.